There's not going to be a bum living in this house. That's what my own son shouted in the living room, finger jammed toward my face, right in front of his wife and my 5-year-old grandson. I was sitting on the couch with my leg a little swollen after a morning at the clinic. I come back tired, not even hungry, and that's how they greeted me. A bum. That's what he had the nerve to call me, Elijah Brooks, who raised that boy with sweat on my brow, working like a mule since I was 15. Now he was calling me a bum just because I was retired and staying in his place for a while, as if it were a favor, as if I had no story, as if I'd never done a thing for him. What he didn't know was that the supposed bum was the owner of the company where he worked. My name is Elijah. I'm 70, born and raised on the west side of Baton Rouge, son of a bricklayer, grandson of a cane field hand, a man of few words and a lot of work. I was a corner store clerk, a bicycle assembler, a trucker's helper, a part salesman, until one day, pushing into my 30s after an unfair firing, I decided to open my own shop. Small, just engine repairs. Then it turned into a storefront. Then came contracts with companies, and one day I became a supplier of industrial machinery. That's when it really took off. I'm not a man of luxuries, you hear? Not much for showing off. Always been a plain shirt, jeans, and work boots kind of man. But the truth is the name behind the big business folks in Baton Rouge know Brooks Industrial was mine. When my wife, Loretta, passed 3 years back, I confess my world fell in. 38 years of marriage don't disappear overnight. The house got too big, too quiet, and my son, Darius, invited me to spend a few months with him. Said he wanted me close. His wife, Tanisha, didn't seem thrilled, but I agreed. I figured being around my grandson would do me good, hearing laughter again in a home. But from the moment I set foot in that house, I felt like I was a problem. Food was counted. The lights were policed. The looks were full of impatience. And I kept to my corner. I didn't want to be in the way. I took the boy to school, did the grocery runs, even washed Darius's car sometimes, but nothing was ever enough. All it took was one day I stayed in bed longer because of the pain in my leg, and he let that line fly. I won't support a bum in this house. I looked at him calmly. I didn't shout, didn't stand, just asked, "A bum me?" He huffed, staring down from on high with the arrogance of someone who thinks he's above everyone, like the world spins for him, like he'd forgotten everything he has was seated by me. "You're retired. You don't work. You just sit there and still want us to take care of you," he said, spitting venom. Tanisha just nodded along as if agreeing. And the worst part, my grandson was in the corner, listening in silence. That hurt more than any insult. I didn't sleep that night. I lay staring at the ceiling of the guest room with my chest tight. I remembered Darius as a child. The times I rode the bus clear across town to pick up his birthday present. The times I went without eating to pay for his school. The new slacks he wore at his graduation, bought on installment. And now I was the bum, just because I got old, just because I'd already given everything I had to give, just because now I needed a little care. But he didn't know, even retired, I was still the name behind the company where he worked. He thought Brooks Industrial belonged to the plant manager now, that I didn't matter there. And that's exactly what I let everybody think, because I never was one to brag. I was one to watch. That contempt, that sentence, that look lit something inside me. An old flame I thought had died, but it was there, quiet, waiting for the right moment. Next morning I got up early, put on a clean shirt, slipped into my black shoes, combed my hair with care like the days of big meetings, and left. I didn't say a word to anyone. I took a cab to Brooks Industrial. I came in through the back door like I always used to. I greeted the receptionist. She recognized me right away and went straight to legal. Called the accountant, asked for time with the attorney, sat with the general manager, requested all the records, contracts, and the employee file for Darius Brooks, my son. I wanted to know everything. How long he'd been there, how he behaved, if there were warnings. What I saw made me breathe deep. Frequent tardiness, misuse of the company car, little parts going missing, customer complaints, and on top of that, cocky with coworkers. That was who he was inside the firm. A problem. Nobody said anything because they believed I protected him for being my son, that I covered everything for him. But they didn't really know me. I came home late. We ate in silence. Tanisha gave me that same old look of disdain. Darius didn't even greet me. I just waited, because when truth arrives it doesn't shout. It doesn't need to explain itself. It just shows up. And when it shows up, the one who needs to understand, understands. The next day everything was going to change, and I wasn't going to raise my voice or slam the table. I'd act with the dignity that always guided me, and with the fairness he himself provoked. I woke before everyone. The sun hadn't slipped past the curtains when I sat on the edge of the bed and recited an old prayer my father taught me when I was a boy. Lord, give me wisdom to speak little, strength to do what's right, and a heart that doesn't repay wrong with more wrong. I dressed calmly, tucked my papers into a leather folder, and went downstairs without a sound, like a man who won't wake pride or ignorance. The kitchen already smelled like coffee. Tanisha was there scrolling her phone while fixing the boys' lunch. She glanced at me sideways with that face that said, "You still here?" I said nothing. I poured a cup, sat at the table, took the first sip in silence. Darius came down minutes later, wearing his company shirt, fighting with a tie he never learned to knot. I watched him struggle in the mirror and couldn't help remembering when I taught him that not the first time, right before his first job interview at a little hardware store. I drove him there, waited outside, and we celebrated like he'd been named general manager. Now he walked past me without a look. But that morning, when he grabbed the keys and headed for the door, I stopped him with one sentence. "Don't go today." He turned, frowning. "What do you mean, don't go? Who are you to tell me that?" "I'm the owner of the company, son," I said without raising my voice. "And today, you're not going." He laughed, like he'd heard a bad joke. You're the owner of Brooks Industrial? I thought you were retired. I thought Mr. Campbell ran the place." "Campbell is the manager. The contract's still in my name. I never signed it over. It's all still mine. And today, I've got something to set straight." Tanisha stared, mouth parted, like for the first time she understood the old man in the guest room was more than a burden. Darius tried to speak, but no words came. Pride was stuck in his throat. He stammered, "You can't do this to me, Dad." "Dad," I said, setting my cup down firmly. "Yesterday I was a bum. Today I'm Dad. Doesn't it bother you to support me anymore?" He looked at me with glassy eyes. For a second I thought he'd apologize, but no. He turned, slammed the door, and left. I sat there finishing my coffee. Truth doesn't need noise. It needs steadiness. At 9 sharp I was in the boardroom. I presented documents, explained the situation, showed the complaints, the ignored warnings, the abused privileges. I formally requested initiation of separation proceedings. No instant firing, no public humiliation, but no favoritism either. Like any employee with a questionable record, Darius would be separated from his post with all his rights. Sure, but no special treatment. The whole board went quiet. Some looked at me with respect, others with surprise, and one or two with relief, because they knew that even if I wasn't around as much, I was still the pillar. After the meeting I walked through the shop floor. Greetings, hugs, a few old friends still around. One said, "Mr. Brooks, I thought you didn't get into these things anymore." Sometimes you got to come back when what you built starts crumbling from the inside. I told him, patting his shoulder. On my way home, I bought a little bag of pralines for my grandson. He loves them. I sat on the bench outside his school and waited. When he saw me, he ran into my arms like nothing had happened. Children don't understand grudges. They understand presence. "Granddad, are you picking me up today?" "Anytime you want, baby. Anytime." We got a popsicle, walked a while, and I told him a made-up story about a dragon who wanted to be a gardener. We laughed, and in that moment I knew it was worth not shouting, not seeking revenge, just doing what's right and protecting what matters. That night Darius came back early. He said nothing at dinner, ate in silence, locked himself in the bedroom, and around midnight I heard him crying. I didn't go in. I didn't comfort him. It wasn't time. A man who hurts with contempt first needs to hear the echo of the emptiness he created. I slept peacefully, because justice doesn't always need a show, just a straight back, a calm heart, and a past that speaks for itself. The next morning the house woke into a heavy quiet, the kind that doesn't break with birdsong or the clink of cups. I rose early, set coffee to brew, toasted 2 biscuits, and sat with the paper like I used to in my own place before everything came loose. No one came down for hours. Tanisha stayed behind her door. Darius, too. The boy, poor thing, was the first to appear, backpack dragging, knuckles rubbing sleep from his eyes. He hugged me without a word and sat beside me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For him, I was still granddad. Whatever the adults were doing didn't matter. At 10, Darius came down slow, pale, eyes swollen. Looked like he hadn't slept. He sat across from me and didn't speak. I didn't either. I poured him a cup, slid it over, and waited, the way you wait for the tide to turn. He stared past me, drinking in silence, until he muttered almost to himself, "Legal sent me a notice." "I know," I said. "I thought you'd give me a chance," he said, voice tight. "Me, your son." I folded the paper and looked at him, not with anger, not with resentment, but as a father who still loves and can't keep pretending. "Son, chances aren't begged for when you've wasted so many. They're built. You had plenty, at the company and here in this house. Or have you forgotten how you treated me 3 days ago?" He went mute, eyes shut like he'd swallowed stones. Necessary pence. Words unsaid on time rot inside the chest, and I wasn't going to store any more rot. "I'm not punishing you, Darius," I said. "I'm teaching you, like when you were a boy. Only now you're a man. When men mess up, they own it, learn, and move on." He pushed back from the table without finishing his coffee and shut himself in the bedroom again. I stayed with my grandson, who was drawing rockets and stars in crayon on scrap paper. "What you got there?" I asked. "A picture of us in a spaceship," he said. Right then I understood something. It didn't matter how many times life floored me. As long as that child saw me as a hero, I had no right to give up. That afternoon, the general manager called asking for an urgent meeting. Seemed Darius had stormed in demanding everything be reversed, threatened lawyers, the press, telling our business in the street. Desperate, childish, humiliating. It didn't surprise me. When a man loses respect for himself, he starts breaking whatever's close. I went to the plant the same day. Not by the back door this time. I walked through reception. I greeted folks with my head high. Some applauded, others came to hug me. Mr. Brooks had returned, not for revenge, but out of respect for my story, my name, what I built with these hands. I asked legal to formalize Darius' separation and went further. I ordered a full audit of his tenure. Not to drown him, but to make sure he learned that mistakes have consequences and that carrying my blood is not a shield. When I got home, Tanisha was in the kitchen. She glanced at me, said nothing. I asked for the boy. He was in his room watching cartoons. I kissed his forehead. "Tomorrow I won't be around," I told him. "I've got a few things to set right." "Where you going, Granddad?" "To fix what I neglected, but what still has a remedy." I left at dawn before the sun finished stretching over the rooftops. No note, no warning. I closed the door softly, the way you do when there are truths that don't need announcing, only living. I walked a few blocks to the bus stop like in my younger days. Even with a company car, I wanted the ground under my feet, the faces of the city, morning air slipping through my shirt reminding me I was alive. Baton Rouge looked the same in a lot of ways. Steam rising from breakfast pots on the corner, the breadman's basket under his arm, kids late for school with backpacks bouncing. But something in me wasn't the same. That day, Elijah Brooks wasn't going out to defend a name. I was going to rebuild respect my own son had tried to trample. I reached the plant at 8:15. The accountant had preliminary audit notes. We sat over an hour, reviewing transfers, approvals with no backup, small personal purchases from corporate accounts. Nothing scandalous, but enough to confirm what I already felt. Darius wore privilege like armor. He hadn't stolen fortunes. He'd taken advantage because he thought he was untouchable. That's not what sinks a company, but it does corrode its soul. I asked the GM to summon the administrative staff for a meeting. At 10 sharp, with more than 30 employees in the training room, I stood and spoke without notes and without a mic. The steady voice of a man with nothing left to prove. "Folks," I said, This company was born in a patch of garage barely big enough for a truck tire. It started with a toolbox, 2 calloused hands, and a stubborn hunger for hot food. I had no degree, no investors, no patron. What I had was my word and my dignity, and that dignity brought me here. Today I'm telling you I won't allow the Brooks name or this company to be smeared by favoritism, impunity, or abuse of trust, and that includes my own son. A murmur rolled through the room. They all knew already, but they needed to hear it from me. Darius Brooks has been separated from his post, I continued. Not because I reject him as a father, but because I refuse to be a boss who looks away when his people fail. Justice starts at home. If I can't be fair with mine, I have no right to demand fairness from anyone. Silence followed. A young woman from HR wiped a quick tear. An old warehouse hand nodded, satisfied. I didn't go back to my office. I went down to the shop floor and worked shoulder to shoulder with the mechanics. Dust grayed my sleeves. Grease marked my shirt. And for a few hours I was the man who once slept beside wrenches and steel. There's a kind of respect you can't buy with titles or inheritance. The kind you earn from the ground up. Near 5 I stopped by the market for okra, chicken, fresh rice, and a jar of dark roux. That night I was going to cook. Fill that house with the smell of my story. When I returned, Tanisha opened the door wearing an expression I couldn't read. Not cold, not warm, just suspended, like she didn't know where we stood. "Where's Darius?" I asked, shifting the bags. "He hasn't left the room all day," she said. I nodded, tied on an apron, and started chopping, seasoning, stirring. The boy came down, eyes bright at the first whiff of gumbo. He sat at the counter, chattering about school and a song he'd learned. I listened like every word was bomb. Dinner was ready at 8. I set plates, spooned rice, ladled gumbo, then went to Darius's door and tapped twice. Nothing. I opened it. He sat on the bed in the dark, staring at the floor. "Food's ready," I said. "Come down if you want." No reply. I went back and ate with my grandson and Tanisha in quiet. Each bite tasted of years, the flavor of reconciliations that go unnamed but float in the air. Darius didn't come. When the dishes were done, I poured a little bourbon and stepped into the yard. The sky was clean, stars hanging like promises. I sat on the old bench and closed my eyes, thinking of my father and mother, how they raised me with so little and such wealth of value, how they taught me being a man wasn't yelling or imposing. It was holding steady, keeping your word, meeting eyes without dropping your gaze. I thought of Darius, how a man can love without approving, and how sometimes loving truly is letting fall. I don't know how long I sat before the door opened behind me. Slow steps, then his voice, low and cracked. "Dad." I didn't answer. I turned my head and left space on the bench. He sat, didn't look at me. "I don't know when I became the man who shouted what I shouted at you," he said. Silence. "You don't have to forgive me," he added. "I just needed you to know I know." I looked back at the sky. "Respect isn't demanded, Darius," I said softly. "It's earned, and you still have time to earn it again. Not with me, with yourself." There was no embrace, no shared tears, just 2 men under the night, one old, one broken, and between them, dignity like a bridge. The next day, the house felt different. Not that tense quiet from before, but a softer stillness, like the walls had finally exhaled after a long storm. Tanisha moved around the kitchen, without that hard look she used to wear. Not warm yet, but not sharp either. Darius had gone out early, leaving his coffee untouched and cooling on the table. I didn't ask where. Sometimes sons need to get lost alone before they can find what's left of themselves. I stayed home with my grandson. We worked on his homework together, heated sweet rolls with butter, and built a rocket ship from an old cardboard box I'd found in the shed. While he laughed, his cheeks smudged with crayon, I realized every firm word I'd said, every limit I'd drawn, wasn't out of anger, it was for him. So he could see his grandfather wasn't some weak old man in the corner, but someone who knew when to speak and when to stand tall. Around noon the phone rang. It was the plant manager. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "your son stopped by this morning. He handed in his resignation, no shouting, no threats. He just asked for the process to stay quiet." I sat for a moment, the receiver warm against my ear. "All right," I said and hung up. I went out to the back porch, cup of lukewarm coffee in my hands, and let the news settle. Sometimes, when you stop shouting back, the other person finally hears themselves. That night, while we prepared dinner, Tanisha chopping onions, me stirring beans, the boy sitting the table, something felt different. Not happiness, but construction. Darius came home at 8. His face was tired, his hands stained with grease. He reminded me of myself when I was starting out. He took off his shoes at the door, greeted the boy first, then looked at me. He didn't speak, just handed me a folded paper, resume. He'd gone to apply for work at a small mechanic shop nearby. Said he wanted to start over. I read the paper without a word, handed it back, and patted his shoulder. Not because he was forgiven, but because I understood. Sometimes a man doesn't need applause or speeches, just a chance to do things differently. Tanisha watched from the counter, unsure whether to believe in him again. But I wasn't waiting for anything. Dignity isn't begged for, it's lived. The days that followed were quiet. My grandson and I went back to our park walks. We stopped at the bakery, where old Mr. Johnson offered me a free loaf when he realized who I was. Folks in the neighborhood began to nod at me with respect again, not as the old man living with his son, but as the man who stood his ground. Things change when you stand up straight. One afternoon, while the sun dipped orange over the rooftops, my grandson asked, "Granddad, why was Dad mad at you?" I thought about my answer. I didn't want to poison his heart or make his father small in his eyes. "Sometimes, son," I said, "grown folks forget where they come from. When that happens, they get lost inside. But if they find their way back, they can start again." "Did you get lost too?" he asked. "Plenty of times," I said, smiling. "But I learned to look for myself in what matters, the work, my word, and family that doesn't quit." He hugged me, small arms tight around my waist, and in that moment I felt peace I hadn't known in years. A few days later, I got a visit from Marcus Campbell, the plant manager and my old partner. He walked in with a manila envelope and a grin. "Elijah," he said, "I know you said you didn't want back in, but after everything that happened, folks here think you should return, not as a boss, but as an advisor, a voice that keeps things steady." I opened the envelope, an official invitation to join the new advisory board of Brooks Industrial, a small salary attached, but mostly respect written between the lines. I smiled. "I don't need to be there every day, Marcus," I said, "but I can help keep things straight. You can count on me." That same afternoon, I walked through the doors of my old office. It was spotless, my nameplate still gleaming on the desk. I ran my hand over the polished wood, breathing in that old smell of machine oil and paper. When you plant dignity, you harvest roots, not flowers. Since then, life found a new rhythm. Not like before. I didn't come in at dawn or stay till dark anymore. I came when needed, talked with the managers, reviewed key decisions, mostly listened. After so many years, I'd learned something. The best way to lead isn't by shouting orders, but by listening. The younger folks running the place had energy, ideas, a hunger to modernize everything overnight. I was like an old lighthouse by the shore, reminding them there's nothing more modern than good sense. They treated me with respect, asked for my advice, and bit by bit, I became a living part of Brooks Industrial again, not as a chief, but as its roots. At home, things also began to shift. Darius kept working at the neighborhood shop. He earned less than half what he used to, but he came home tired and more human. We didn't talk about the past. I didn't ask about his new job, but I could see it. The humility growing in him, the kind that comes only when you've lost your footing and started from scratch. Tanisha, too, had changed. Quieter now, less defensive. She no longer complained about my presence or frowned when I moved through the house. We weren't friends, but the tension that used to slice the air was gone. And the boy, he was my anchor. He waited for me with drawings, stories, endless questions. He made me feel alive, needed, and that, at my age, was worth more than any plaque on the wall. One evening, while I was cleaning an old toolbox in the backyard, I found a faded photo of Darius when he was 8. He was sitting on my lap, hands smeared with grease, grinning wide. That was the day I showed him how to change an oil filter. He'd run to tell his mama he could fix engines, just like Daddy. I sat there staring at that photo, wondering when that bond had broken. Not that I wanted to turn back time. No, I'd long accepted what was. But sometimes it hurts not knowing the exact corner where your child stops admiring you and starts resenting you. Maybe it's inevitable. Maybe every father faces it. Or maybe we just stopped talking too soon. That night at dinner, the boys suddenly blurted out. At school, they asked what my granddad does. I told them, you're the boss of all the people who fix big machines. Darius bowed his head. Tanisha smiled nervously. I ruffled the boy's hair. No, son, I said. Not a boss. Just someone who knows when to get his hands dirty. There was a small silence, but in that silence, something changed. Darius looked up at me, not with wounded pride, but with something closer to recognition, as if he was finally starting to understand that authority isn't imposed, it's earned. That a man's worth isn't measured by power, but by what he inspires. A few days later, I got a call from the State Technical Institute. They'd heard my story through one of the plant workers and wanted me to give a talk to the students studying mechanics. I'd never thought of myself as a teacher, but I said yes. When I arrived, they had the chairs set in a half circle, a pot of coffee on the table, and 20 or so young men waiting, eyes bright with curiosity. I didn't talk about engines. I talked about failure, the nights I slept in the shop because I couldn't afford rent, how I hauled parts on my back before I had workers, the times I cried quietly because I couldn't buy my boy a uniform. I told them being a man wasn't about holding everything in. It was knowing when to speak, when to ask for help. One of them raised his hand. Sir, what's the hardest part about getting old? I thought for a moment. Watching your own child forget who you were, I said, and having to remind him, without destroying him. A soft wave of applause followed. Some came up afterward to hug me. I left with my heart lighter than it had been in years. That night, when I got home, Darius was sitting outside on the same bench where I'd spent so many sleepless hours. He had a beer in his hand. He offered me one. We sat without talking for a long time. Then he said, Tanisha thinks we should get our own place. She says it's time to live on our own. I didn't move. I'd expected it. That's good, I said. Every family needs its own space. I'm not here to be a burden. I just came to walk with you for a while. You didn't just come, he said. You came because we asked, and we're the ones who failed. When I finally met his eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in him for years, humility. Not weakness, but the kind born of walking through fire and coming out barehanded, lighter. You don't owe me anything, Darius, I told him. Just do better with your boy. Make sure he never has to remind you who you are. We sat watching the sky fade from blue to black, the first stars blinking over Baton Rouge. I realized then I didn't need an apology anymore. He'd already given it, not in words, but in silence, in work, in dignity. And for a man like me, that was enough. A few weeks passed after that evening on the porch, and life settled into a quiet rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Darius and Tanisha found a small house in a calm neighborhood on the edge of town, 2 bedrooms, a little backyard, a kitchen that still smelled of fresh paint. They told me about it over dinner one night, their voices measured, almost as if asking permission. But there was nothing to ask for. I'd known this day would come, and though a sharp ache pressed at my chest because it meant the boy would go too, I didn't let it show. I simply nodded, wished them the best, and told them I'd help with the move. Because one thing I'd learned, you don't hold on to what no longer belongs to you. That house, that space, that rhythm of their lives, it wasn't mine anymore. I had done what I needed to do. I'd drawn a line. Now it was their turn to build something of their own. That weekend, I helped load boxes into a rented truck. Tanisha, always precise, labeled everything in careful handwriting, while Darius tried to keep the boy entertained. At one point, the child ran over to me clutching a drawing. "This is so you don't forget me, Granddad," he said, handing me a sheet of paper, showing us both sitting under a big oak tree. I knelt, hugged him tight, and told him that drawing was worth more than 1,000 photos. I folded it gently and slipped it into my shirt pocket, right over my heart. When they finally drove off, I stood at the gate watching the truck turn the corner. The silence that followed was deep, but not empty. It was the kind that brings a strange peace, the kind that comes after you've done what was right, even when it hurt. I took a long breath. Not sadness, acceptance. There's something powerful in knowing you acted with truth, that you didn't lower yourself, didn't answer insult with rage or contempt with tears. The first days alone were strange. Breakfast in silence, the TV humming to itself, the couch too big, the kitchen spotless. But slowly I began to find my rhythm again. I started reading every morning, taking walks through the park in the afternoons. I fixed the back fence that had been leaning for months, met up with old friends I hadn't seen in years, even joined a gardening class at the community center. Life kept going, not the same, but still going. And the best part was that now every step, every choice was mine. No frowns, no whispered arguments, no tension hanging in the air. Just peace. One evening, as I watered the young plants by the wall, the phone rang. It was Marcus Campbell from the plant again. He wanted my help reviewing a contract with a foreign company interested in partnering with Brooks Industrial. "We need someone with experience and a strong voice in the room," he said. I didn't hesitate. I put on a clean white shirt, polished shoes, and headed straight there. When I walked into the boardroom, everyone stopped what they were doing. They stood, offered me the head seat, poured me water before I could ask. They looked at me like a father returning home with his head held high. During the meeting, I didn't speak much, but when I did, I spoke clearly. When it came time to decide whether to sell part of the company to that foreign group, I was the first to speak against it. Not everything that shines is worth grabbing, I said. We built this with our own hands. Let's not trade our roots for promises that may never grow. After my words, silence filled the room, then slow nods. In the end, the board agreed. They decided not to sell, at least not yet, because there are things built with such effort that they can't be swapped for quick rewards. I left that meeting with my soul at peace, not because I'd been right, but because I still mattered, because my voice still carried weight. And that kind of respect doesn't come from titles or money. It comes from living with principle. On the way home, I passed by Darius's new house. It was mostly dark except for one small light in the boys' room. I stopped on the sidewalk for a moment unseen. I wondered if one day Darius would truly understand everything I'd done, not as punishment, but as a lesson in dignity. I didn't wait for an answer. I'd learned long ago that you don't do the right thing for applause. You do it because it's what's right. Back at home, I made cinnamon tea and sat on the bench in my yard. The stars were out, the air warm and calm. I thought about the years gone by, the words left unsaid, the times I wanted to shout but didn't, the silences that spoke louder than any speech. And I realized something. You never stop being a father, but you do learn when to stand on your own, to draw your lines, to say enough. Not out of anger, but out of self-respect, because the respect you allow others to strip from you is the hardest to win back. Days passed quietly, as if the world around me had finally found its place. I woke with the sunlight slipping through the curtains, made my coffee slow, sat at the kitchen table watching the sky change color. No shouting, no footsteps rushing down the hall, no tension behind closed doors, just birds outside and the soft whistle of the kettle. I found myself grateful for the small things I'd once ignored, the smell of toast, the hum of bees in the yard, the peace of silence. I didn't need more. After all I'd lived through, I finally understood that peace isn't having company. It's being surrounded by respect. Weeks went by, and I decided to help out at the neighborhood workshop where young people learn trades. Most of them came from rough backgrounds, kids who'd grown up fast and trusted slow. I taught them the basics: how to use a wrench, how to listen to an engine, how to fix without rushing. But what I really gave them wasn't technique, it was patience. Stories, lessons about mistakes and endurance, about how one loose bolt can ruin a whole system. Without meaning to, I became something I never thought I'd be, a teacher. Not in a classroom, but in life. And the best part, none of them saw me as the old man. They listened. They asked questions. They waited for my answers. And at my age, that was more than enough to make me feel useful again. One afternoon, While we were fixing an old sewing machine someone had brought from home, I noticed one of the boys, thin, quiet, with eyes too heavy for his age, always stayed late. He cleaned the tables, organized the tools, left last. One day I asked his name. "I'm Isaiah," he said. I offered him a piece of cornbread and some coffee from my thermos, and we sat in the shade outside. He didn't talk much, but little by little I learned his story. He lived alone with his grandmother, never knew his father. No one had ever told him, "You're doing good, son." That boy reminded me of Darius, not by what he said, but by what he held back. That same mix of anger and longing. And right then, I realized something else. What I couldn't fully fix with my son, I could still try to do for others. Because you can't change the past, but you can turn your mistakes into light for someone else's path. From that day on, I made sure Isaiah knew he wasn't invisible. I showed him what patience looked like, how to take pride in small steps. And slowly, I felt my story stretch beyond disappointment. It became purpose. My legacy wasn't just blood. It was anyone willing to learn with their hands and listen with their heart. My story didn't end with a son who failed me. It kept going through the young ones still learning what it means to stand tall. Because blood sons may lose their way, but sons of example, those never forget. One Saturday morning, I was sweeping the front porch when I saw Darius step out of a taxi, a cardboard box in his hands. He wasn't with Tanisha, and the boy wasn't there either. He walked up to the gate, gave a short nod, and asked quietly, "Can I come in?" I didn't say a word, just opened the gate. He came in, set the box on the table, and pulled something from inside that froze me where I stood. My old notebooks, the ones where I'd scribbled engine diagrams, quotes, lists of customers, ideas for improvements, notes I'd thought lost years ago. "I kept them," he said. "I never threw them out. I just didn't know what to do with them." I sat down, picked one up, and ran my fingers over the worn pages like I was touching a piece of my own soul. Every grease stain, every doodle, every half-written thought carried pieces of who I used to be. My hands trembled a little, not from age, but from memory. He watched me quietly and then said, "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness. I know there are things a sorry can't erase. I just wanted to give you these back." I looked at him, eyes steady. Sometimes returning something means more than saying sorry. I told him. He nodded and stayed a while. Helped me repair the back door that had been squeaking for months. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. We worked side by side, tools passing from one hand to the other like in the old days. When he was done, I walked him to the gate. He held out his hand, and I gripped it tight. No words, just the kind of handshake that says everything that needs saying. He turned and walked away without looking back. And for the first time in a long while, that didn't hurt. Because real reconciliation doesn't always end with tears or hugs. Sometimes it ends with quiet understanding and separate roads. That night, I pulled out all my old notebooks and spread them across the table. I read them slowly, page by page. There were sketches from when Brooks Industrial was nothing more than an idea, formulas for engine torque, lists of people who once trusted me with their machines, even notes Loretta used to leave me. Short lines like, "Don't forget to eat," or, "You're doing fine, Eli." I smiled, laughed quietly, and yes, cried a little too. My life had never been rich in luxuries or fame, but I had something better: memory. And when you're old, memory is the richest treasure you can own. Because as long as you remember, you're not gone, not useless, not forgotten. You're still living. The next morning, I took one of those notebooks to the community workshop. I showed it to Isaiah and explained where each page came from, what I'd learned the hard way, what I wished someone had told me at his age. He stared wide-eyed, careful not to smudge the paper. "Why are you showing me this, Mr. Brooks?" he asked. "Because," I said, "the things you learn in silence are the ones you can pass on without shouting." He smiled shyly, and that day worked with more care than I had ever seen, tightening each bolt as if each one were sacred. Watching him, I realized my legacy no longer depended on whether Darius ever said "you were right." My legacy lived on in hands like Isaiah's, in the voices that listened to mine, in that bench where I shared my story. Because sometimes the sons born of your blood lose their way, But the sons born of your example, they never forget. One clear Sunday morning, the sky stretched pure blue, not a cloud in sight. It felt like a day meant for walking. I put on my linen shirt, my wide-brimmed hat, and went out without any plan, hands clasped behind my back, memories walking beside me. I passed the church where Loretta and I had married. The paint was peeling, but the bell still rang the same deep note that used to shake the street on Sundays. A few blocks farther, I stopped by the rusted gate of the elementary school where Darius learned his first letters. I could almost hear the laughter echoing from long ago. People recognized me as I walked. Old faces, neighbors, some calling out my name. They didn't forget entirely in a town like Baton Rouge. People move on, but when they see a man who stayed honest, they remember, even in silence. That kind of respect, quiet, deep, is worth more than all the plaques on a wall. At an empty lot where the old farmer's market used to be, a group of kids played soccer with a ragged ball. Barefoot, laughing, falling, getting up again. I stood watching, smiling. One of them ran up and asked, "You want to play, sir?" I laughed. "My knees can't take that, son, but I can be the referee." The rest cheered. So I stood under the sun, calling out imaginary fouls, clapping for their goals, laughing right along with them. When the game ended, a boy no older than 10 asked, "Are you famous? My dad says you used to own a big company." I crouched down to his height, smiled, and said, "I didn't make a fortune, son. I made a story. And if you understand that, you'll be richer than most." They all grinned, ran off again, and I kept walking home with dust on my shoes and a light heart. When I got back, I made myself some coffee and sat on my bench like always, not out of habit, but out of gratitude. Everything I'd planted over the years, my way of working, my way of speaking, the respect I showed others, had taken root, not in money or recognition, but in something much deeper, respect. And true respect doesn't need applause. You feel it in how people listen, how they remember your name, how they speak of you when you're not around. A week later, Isaiah came by with a folder clutched in his hands. He was nervous, eyes wide but proud. "I got in," he said breathlessly. "They gave me a scholarship for industrial maintenance in the city. You wrote me that recommendation letter, remember? They said it made the difference." I couldn't help but smile. "You earned it, son. You did the work." He hugged me suddenly tight, like a son would, and said, "You changed how I see things, Mr. Brooks. Now I want to do things right, not fast." I didn't cry, but something in my chest loosened. I gripped his shoulder strong. "You're not alone anymore," I told him. That was enough. That night, sitting on the porch again, I realized I no longer needed Darius to come back and tell me I'd been right all along. Every young man who took my advice, every neighbor who greeted me with warmth, every memory that stayed alive in those notebooks, that was enough. A few days later, Darius called. "Dad," he said, "the boy's been asking about you. Can he stay with you for the weekend?" "Of course," I said without hesitation. "This is still his home." Saturday morning, my grandson arrived at the door, backpack bouncing, grin wide. Holding a tin of cookies, he said he'd help bake. We spent the day together building a wooden toy, watching old cartoons, cooking rice pudding. That night, before bed, he asked, "Are you happy, Granddad?" I paused at the doorway, the light from the hall spilling across his little face. "Yes, son. I'm happy because I learned I don't need anyone's forgiveness to keep moving forward." He smiled, maybe not fully understanding, but something in his eyes told me the words had found a place to rest. I turned off the light, sat in the living room, opened one of my notebooks, and began to write. Not about engines this time, but about him. About the boy who might one day forget his old granddad for a while, but who, years later, might see a workbench or a tool and remember the man who taught him quietly, without shouting, what it meant to live with dignity. And right then, I made peace with everything. When I turned 74, there was no party. I didn't want one. No cake, no balloons, no noise. What I got instead was something better: silence, coffee brewing on the stove, and the sound of a small voice shouting from the front door, "Granddad, happy birthday." It was my grandson, holding a hand-drawn card in one hand and a wilted flower in the other. I opened my arms, and he ran into them. In that embrace, time seemed to stop. I didn't need anything else. Right there, I understood. Happiness doesn't come from noise or gifts. It comes from living with your head high, from being remembered with respect. Darius came too. He didn't bring a present or any rehearsed words. He just sat quietly in the yard while I talked to the boy about tools, soil, and how to plant a seed without breaking the root. Tanisha didn't come. She never came back after moving out. I didn't hold it against her. Some people can't bear the weight of what they've kept silent. But that's all right. Life doesn't demand that everyone stay. What matters is learning to live peacefully with whoever does. That night, after the boy had fallen asleep in the bed that once belonged to his father, I went out to the patio. I lit the old kerosene lamp, the one Loretta had bought at a yard sale decades ago, and sat on the bench that had already molded itself to my back. The wood creaked in a familiar way. I opened one of my notebooks, found a blank page, and started to write. Not for anyone to read, but to keep my chest from overflowing. I wrote about silence, about distance, the kind that heals, not wounds. About love that doesn't ask for applause. I wrote about how the world keeps turning even when you're no longer at its center, and how peace often arrives the moment you stop begging for approval. Weeks passed calmly. The boy began visiting more often, and with every visit, Darius seemed a little lighter. He'd sit with me in the evenings, not to talk about himself, but to listen. Sometimes he'd help me with little repairs, or ask me how I managed not to quit when everything once felt uphill. I told him stories, not the proud ones, but the honest ones. The mistakes, the anger, the regrets. I showed him I wasn't a hero, just a man who learned to keep standing even when life knocked him down. Because the best legacy you can give a son isn't perfection, it's truth. One Sunday afternoon, while walking through the park with my grandson, he looked up and asked, "Granddad, are you going to die soon?" Children ask such things without fear, without filters. I stopped, met his eyes, and smiled. "Someday," I said, "but the important thing isn't when we go. It's how we live before we do." He frowned, thinking, then said softly, "You lived good, didn't you?" "I lived with dignity, son. Sometimes it hurt, sometimes it was quiet, but always with my head up." He squeezed my hand, and we kept walking, his small steps matching mine. That night, long after he'd fallen asleep, I sat awake thinking about everything I'd built. Not just machines or a business, but character, resilience, a way of seeing the world. I realized that when respect is real, it doesn't vanish when you're gone. It lingers. That's the only inheritance worth leaving. A few days later, I had a visitor from the Technical Institute where Isaiah was studying. The director wanted to thank me in person. He told me Isaiah had become one of the best students in the program, that he talked about me often, about how I changed the way he saw work and life. "You gave that boy direction," the man said. "He wants to come back one day and teach, just like you." I nodded, holding back emotion. I didn't need his words to know it. I'd seen it in Isaiah's eyes the day he left. That was one of my greatest victories. Not wealth, not recognition, but the simple fact that I hadn't turned bitter. I hadn't answered neglect with hate, but with patience. And the harvest had come. Near the end of that year, I wrote a letter. I folded it neatly and placed it inside one of my notebooks. It wasn't for Darius. It was for my grandson, to be opened when I was gone. In it, I told him who I was, what I'd built, what had broken me, and what I'd learned. I wrote about his father without anger, and I asked only one thing of him. Never let anyone tell you your granddad was a useless old man. Because even when life pushed me into a corner, I never stopped standing tall. One morning, as I sat barefoot on the porch steps, the mug warm between my palms, I felt something deep inside me. A quiet certainty. Not fear, not sadness, just a sense that I was ready. Not to die, but to rest from all the weight I'd carried in silence. I breathed in, looked at the sky, and smiled. Everything had been worth it, the tears, the losses, the moments when I had to stay silent to keep my dignity intact. I'd lived exactly as I needed to, without betraying my story. And I thought then, if one day they go looking for me, I hope they don't search in a graveyard. Look for me in the workshop, where a young man listens with care. in an old notebook full of sketches and notes, in a weathered bench that still holds the shape of a tired back. Look for me in the memory of anyone who still believes that being a man means never forgetting where you came from. Because that's what I tell my son and every man who comes after him. It's never too late to start over. Never too late to say, enough. Never too late to rise again, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And if life ever pushes you the way it pushed me, don't fall. Stand. Even if your legs tremble, stand with dignity. As I closed my notebook for the last time that night, I imagined my grandson years later grown, maybe standing in a shop, surrounded by the sound of tools and engines. Maybe one day he'll open that letter, feel the rough paper under his fingers, and hear my voice whispering through the lines. And maybe he'll smile, just like I did that last morning, knowing that the old man who once sat on this porch didn't leave riches or property behind, but something far greater, a story of resilience, a name kept clean, and the echo of a life lived standing tall. Because in the end, that's all a man truly owns, his word, his work, and the respect that time can never take away.